The Xperia XA2 and the XA2 Ultra are two of the latest well-rounded mid-range phones that Sony has in tow for the US market. Both come with the promises of long battery life and spectacular camera. I'm Vic Christoph with PhoneArena with our review of the Xperia XA2 and the XA2 Ultra. If I have to describe the Xperia XA2 and XA2 Ultra with just one word, after having played with both for a week, I would say they feel sturdy, even despite their plastic back. Both phones have a pleasant heft to them, although the 6-inch XA2 Ultra is definitely pushing boundaries with its large dimensions. The size makes it hard to operate the XA2 Ultra, and it's also very heavy at nearly half a pound. One thing is for sure, you will always know if it's in your pocket. Meanwhile, the XA2 is much easier to handle and operate, even with a single hand, and I vastly preferred it over the Ultra for this reason alone. When it comes to overall build, the plastic on the back feels nice to touch, and unlike most glass phones, does not get all smudged with fingerprints easily. But it's still plastic and feels, well, a bit plasticky. The middle frame of the phone is made of metal though, and the buttons are also metal and have a nice clicky feel. There is even a separate camera shutter button, which is nice. Now on the other side you have the SIM card slot. You don't need a special pin to take it out and insert your SIM card. You can just easily take it off using just your fingers. It's a nice detail, but what is not so nice is that the phone automatically reboots when you swap SIM cards. On the bottom you have a USB Type-C port for charging, a headphone jack, and a microSD card slot. Now there are two things missing from the XA2 series: waterproofing and stereo speakers. Now the one speaker that we have is loud enough for us to forgive the latter, but we do wish Sony added some sort of water protection for extra safety. Fingerprint scanners. They have been on smartphones in the past 5 years or so, enough for us to forget there were phones without the useful scanners in the first place. Sony was the only one so kind to remind us every year its phones in the US lacked fingerprint scanners all the way until today. Well, believe it or not, now in 2018 Sony has finally made phones with fingerprint scanners. The XA2 series both have a fingerprint reader on their backs, and it's right below the camera. And it works just like you'd expect from a modern phone. Fast and reliable. Finally Sony, finally. The big difference between the XA2 and the Ultra is screen size. The XA2 has a 5.2-inch display, big but not gigantic. So Sony also made the Ultra, and this one is, well, gigantic indeed. It's a 6-inch screen, but it's not a 2x1 screen that would be narrow and taller. No, this is a regular wide 16:9 display that you either love or cannot quite hold in your hand because it's so big. Or because you have teeny tiny hands. Okay, maybe it's the screen that's too big after all. On a more positive note, a 16:9 screen does have a surprising amount of advantages over 2x1 screens. First, video looks perfectly fine on it and you don't get black bars. Secondly, 16:9 screens come with big bezels with plenty of space for nice and clicky physical buttons on the bottom. Just like the Xperia XA2 and the Ultra, right? Well, not exactly. These two have a big bezel on the top and bottom, but there is nothing on those bezels. The bottom bezel is just there sitting quite useless and abandoned. Instead you get on-screen buttons, which are okay. These two are also LCD screens. They're quite reflective, which makes them a bit hard to see outdoors. Colors are lively and vivid, but also just a bit on the cold side, with bluish whites. You can tweak this to a certain extent when you go into display settings though. Both also feature a Full HD resolution, which is sharp enough for most people. Okay, next let's talk software. The new Sony ship with Android 8.0 Oreo out of the box, thank you Sony. On top of it is Sony's Xperia user interface, which keeps things mostly clean and fast. You do get some neat options, like an easy way to change the icons to whatever you like. You also get plenty of Google apps on board, just as you'd expect. Under the hood, both phones run on the Qualcomm Snapdragon 630 chip. This is a step below the flagship level 8 series of chips, but we could not see all that much of a difference, to be honest. In the daily grind, everything runs fairly smoothly and without a stutter. and even with more demanding games, I rarely noticed a significant drop in frame rates. Good news is that the Snapdragon 630 also does not get hot when you play an intense game like Hungry Shark Evolution or when you are multitasking. Speaking of multitasking, the XA2 only has 3GB of RAM, a notable sin for an Android phone. This means apps will reload if you start multitasking heavily. The Ultra has 4GB of RAM, which is an improvement for power users. On board you also get 32GB of native storage on both, and around 24 of them are actually available to use. 32GB is a bit on the low side these days, and even cheaper phones come with 64GB, so Sony did cheap out a bit here. Thankfully you have a microSD card slot in cases of storage emergency. For connectivity, the XA2 series support a range of LTE bands, but if you're getting them in the US, you'll only be able to use them on GSM carriers such as AT&T or T-Mobile. No Verizon or Sprint support, unfortunately. Globally, everything should work fine in most countries as they support a wider range of LTE bands. Sony makes most of the camera sensors for phones and DSLRs, but its own phones are usually not the most advanced camera phones out there. We don't know why that is, but let's see how the XA2 series do with the camera. You get a dual front camera on the larger Ultra and even a front-facing flash for those nighttime selfies. One of these cameras is a regular 16-megapixel shooter, while the other is an 8-megapixel one with a much wider field of view, a whole 120-degree lens. There's also optical image stabilization on board with both cameras. The smaller XA2, however, lacks most of that. It only has the one front camera, the one with the wide field of view. As far as the main cameras are concerned, we get the same setup on both. A 23-megapixel camera with steady shot electronic image stabilization, which works great, and very fast hybrid autofocus. When it comes to image quality, the Ultra and the XA2 are definitely above average performers, though they have their issues. Sharpness and detail are very good, but dynamic range isn't. Highlights often tend to get burned, whereas shadows are sometimes a bit darker than we wish they were. In low light, images start looking very compromised with a lot of noise, and you definitely see the difference with more expensive phones here. Both phones also shoot 4K video, 30 frames per second. Overall, we're impressed with video quality. It is stabilized, it looks sharp and with a lot of detail, and just nice. It's not quite flagship grade and you notice things like the lesser dynamic range, but it's good enough for what it is. Despite the big size difference between the two phones, I find it strange that Sony included a rather modest 3600 mAh battery in the Ultra, only very slightly larger than the 3300 mAh cell on the smaller XA2. Now in reality, both phones do well with battery life. The XA2 series live up to expectations and even exceed them. On our proprietary test, the smaller XA2 got a score of more than 10 hours, way above the average, while the XA2 Ultra checked one of the best results ever at 12 hours and 8 minutes. That easily translates to almost 2 days of moderate to even heavy use. Unfortunately, Sony does not include a fast charger in the box, and it takes more than 3 hours to fully charge the battery on the larger Ultra. We definitely recommend spending those extra $10 or more in getting a third-party fast charger that will speed things up with charging. So, with all things said and considered, what is the final verdict? Are the new Xperias worth it? At start, the XA2 costs $350 while the Ultra goes for $450, and this pricing is actually quite reasonable and on par with rivals. And the rivals here are the Moto X4 with sleeker design and wide main camera, the faster and slightly more expensive OnePlus 5T, as well as the Galaxy A8 with its beautiful AMOLED screen, and the Honor 9 with its refined glass design. But even with their plastic design and other minor flaws, the new XA2 series excel where it matters. They're snappy performers with great battery life. If you don't obsess over a camera and thin phone design, we can safely recommend getting the XA2 series, and this wraps our review. Thanks for staying until the end. Hit that like button if you enjoyed watching this video, subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to get notified about new videos, and I will see you in the next one.